Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining First Draft's Reporting on Coronavirus webinar series. First Draft, we're a global nonprofit. We support journalists, academics, and technologists working to address the challenges of trust and truth in a digital age. And there are a lot of challenges right now. My name is Wardle. I am the US Director of First Draft, and I am joined today by Rory Smith, who is our research manager, and Nell Conway from our events team, who's going to be handling the housekeeping and the Q&A. So today we're discussing basic computational methods for tracking coronavirus trends. And I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty excited about this. I don't know much about this topic. And when I saw Rory's slides, I was like, I've got so many questions. So as Rory goes through, I'm going to stop at different moments when Rory takes a breath to asking some questions, but please do add your own to the Q&A section. But I promise you, this is going to be really interesting and really useful. So over to you, Rory.
All right, thank you very much, Claire. Yep, as Claire said, I'm the research manager at First Draft, and I will be running you guys through this module, which is basic computational methods for tracking coronavirus trends. So we are entering the era of post-API reporting and research. And what I want to say with that is that many platforms have curbed access to their APIs for the public or closed them altogether, complicating efforts to research and investigate suspicious content in any comprehensive way. So the tools we now have to do this type of research and reporting are limited in terms of the data they capture, but they still offer ways for us to do meaningful analyses. So CrowdTangle is one of these platforms that gives us access to look at Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit data, and specifically to capture kind of historical data on these platforms. Of course, I need to caveat this with that the data isn't comprehensive, but it gives us enough to do meaningful analysis and look at trends. And then we have Twitter's APIs. So Twitter is kind of the outlier insofar as making access to their APIs relatively public. However, again, this comes with a strong caveat. The public-facing search API that we're going to be running through only allows you to look at data a week back in time. So it's great if there's a popping hashtag, which you can plug in, you can scrape and look at the accounts surrounding that. But in terms of doing kind of long-term analyses on trends, we're still very much limited in what we can do with Twitter's data. So first off, I need to underline this point, or the tipping point. And it's a concept that's really important in all the work we do at First Draft. As it allows us to see if content has reached a certain threshold, and that threshold generally determines whether we should report on it or not. I know a lot of journalists get excited when they uncover a piece of misleading or suspicious content or disinformation, and they want to report on it immediately. However, oftentimes this kind of information has stayed within certain communities. There's only reached a few eyeballs, and by reporting on it, we actually amplify the suspicious or misleading content, whereas otherwise it might have died or might have just stayed in those communities. So the ability to unpack a lot of this data and see how much traction posts or tweets have gotten is really important to measuring the tipping point. And at First Draft, we have 5 different kind of metrics we use, or kind of factors that we use to deem whether a piece of content has hit the tipping point. So how much engagement has it received? And is it just likes or are there lots of shares? So we're not necessarily too concerned if it's just being liked a lot. It becomes problematic when this content starts to be shared, because that means it's spreading. Number 2 is the discussion limited to one community online? So if it's stuck in kind of conspiracy communities, or such as the anti-vax community, and it's only being seen by 100 people, we're not necessarily all that interested in reporting on it. Again, we don't want to amplify this message and spread it outside of these communities where the likelihood of actually spreading from these small conspiracy communities is quite small. Has the content jumped platforms? If it's just on 4chan, yes, it's interesting. We should probably monitor it, but we're not too concerned about this content unless it starts jumping up. We're jumping on to Facebook or Reddit, or being tweeted out. Also, did an influencer or verified account share it? What we've seen during the coronavirus is that influencer accounts or influencers in general do share misleading information, which then gets picked up by lots of people. And at this point, it's generally a good signal that it has reached a tipping point. And lastly, did the mainstream media share it? And at that point, it's a very good sign that this has definitely hit the tipping point. And I'm not sure, Claire, if you want to add on to what I just said.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really important basis for the conversations we're having, because often when we teach this, people say, well, what's the limit? Is it 79,000 retweets? And the challenge is that the tipping point differs, obviously, if you're in Sao Paulo or if you're in a local newspaper in Ohio. And so I think the one thing to say about this is, yes, there are metrics, and I think Rory's going to go through some of the ways that you measure it. But I think that question of how it changes is really important. And the other big question mark right now is closed messaging apps, of course, which we're seeing a lot of rumors circulating there. And there's no API. And Rory, you might want to describe what an API is. Even as you were starting, I was like, oh, we should probably go through that. But like, there isn't an API for WhatsApp, but you can't do this kind of work for closed messaging apps, which is where we're seeing a lot of this content. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, so essentially an API it's an acronym for application programming interface, and it's a way to communicate with databases housed by Facebook and by the platforms essentially. So you input a bit of code and it communicates with the databases and it returns that data or whatever data you're interested in essentially downloading or scraping. So that in its most basic form, that's what an API is. Feel free to investigate it further. It's a bit more complex than that, but in the most general and basic sense, that's what it is. You're communicating with these platforms and their data, retrieving it, and then sending it back to you, essentially. CrowdTangle data for trends. Number one, if you don't have CrowdTangle, you can request access through it through the following email address. It's free for journalists and researchers, and we highly recommend you do get access to this because it's one of the only tools we have to effectively monitor Facebook and Instagram. So if you don't have it, please get access to it, and it is free. So no reason not to. Today we're gonna be covering the save search function because this is the best way of essentially bulk downloading historical data. There is a historical data feature in CrowdTangle, but it's a bit flimsy in terms of looking for key phrases. So we recommend that you use the save search feature in particular to do this type of stuff. So once you arrive on the CrowdTangle dashboard, which looks like this is kind of the landing page. And this is specifically the CrowdTangle landing page for Facebook. You see that there's a saved searches feature on the left-hand side in that column there. Now click on new search and you'll see that there is also a pages feature. So that allows you to toggle between pages and groups. Again, the CrowdTangle system is a bit flimsy again and doesn't allow you to search for both pages and groups together. So unfortunately, you have to select either pages or groups, but we'll get to that further and how to merge those two later. And then we want to name our saved search. In this instance, at first draft, we've seen lots of misinformation around the coronavirus dying at temperatures around 26 to 27 degrees Celsius. And in this example, we want to see how much traction these rumors have gotten. So we're going to give the name of this saved search high temperature, just a generic kind of name for a saved search. So you input your search there, and then don't forget to click the icon saved search. This is important. Now, once you've done that, we go into the edit search feature and we click on that. And that results in the following setup. So if you see the red circle with number 1 around it, this is CrowdTangle's version of a Boolean search. Again, Twitter, it's a bit more straightforward, but here you see any of these words, that is effectively, those words separated by the comment are effectively or statements. So we're looking in posts for coronavirus or coronavirus 2 words or COVID. And then where it says all of these words, we have the 2627, which is essentially a part of this, a part of one of the posts we saw, which suggests 26 to 27 degrees. We input that. So when we combine this together, this means that we are looking at coronavirus and 2627 or coronavirus and 2627 or COVID and 2627. We're looking for any one of those combinations in all Facebook posts, right? And that's what that means. And then we want to save that search. So click on save, and then we want to go up to the posts icon at the top. So that's step 3 here. And by navigating through the post feature or the post icon, we get to this setup here. And this allows us to change kind of the parameters that we're interested in investigating. And the beauty about CrowdTangle, it does give us rich historical data. So for the purposes of this example and just kind of all suspicious information that we're looking at related to coronavirus, we generally create a time frame that goes from December the 1st, 2019 to today. I did this example a few days ago, so it's on the 31st, but you can get up to the data essentially. And you do that in a custom icon, which is circled there. And then we're interested in total interactions, right? We want to see how many interactions each one of these posts has gotten. And what that will result in is a CSV with tons of rich data fields, which we'll get to in a second. But you can only get those rich data fields if you select the total interactions feature, right? And then once you've done that, you see on the right-hand screen, there is a little download icon. First, press go so that you refresh all the data and it accords to these new parameters that you've inputted. And then you can download it, and CrowdTangle will send this directly to your email. And it generally arrives there within kind of, a few minutes to sometimes it could get to 15 minutes, depends on how much data they actually have to send. So like I said before, unfortunately, CrowdTangle doesn't allow you to combine groups and pages in one search. So we have to do the same thing again, but with groups. And that essentially requires us to follow the same exact steps as we did. But when you get to the search bar, when you're naming your search, you toggle on the pages icon and switch it to groups, and then repeat the same exact steps as we did before. And this is what the CSVs look like that are outputted through your Save Search download. And it comes with a heaps of very interesting data fields, right? So you can see the type of content, whether it's live video, whether it's a photo, native video, just a post. You see when it was created at, so there's timestamps. You get the page names and the Facebook IDs, and then you get all these different kind of interactions, which is really interesting and invites, all types of different analyses depending on what you're interested in looking at. So you get shares, you get kind of the love emojis, the wow emojis, angry emojis. It's all there, and there are many different things you can do with that. And below that, you can see all the different fields that are available through kind of bulk loading this data through the Save Search feature. All right, so once we have our two CSVs, once they arrived in your mailbox, the next step is to merge them into one. So here you can use kind of any data analysis tools you're most familiar with. Pandas and Python is what First Draft use. So for the sake of this example, we're going to be using this, but you can also do the same stuff in R. You can also do it in Excel, although it's going to be a bit more time consuming and arguably a bit more complicated to do it there, just because there's a lot of cleaning. Not a lot, but a bit of cleaning that is involved. So here, if you look at the second panel there, what we've done is created a open CSV function, which essentially reads the CSV in and then changes some of the fields. So it will amend some of the timestamps as well as some of the new number formats so that they're then readable in some of our analyses. And what I mean by that is some of the formats, number formats come as strings. And if you want to apply any kind of mathematical equations or do any statistical analysis, you can't do that on string entities. And what I mean by that are like words are considered strings, whereas numbers are considered numbers, but oftentimes the numbers come as strings. So we have to combine that to numbers to do analyses. And we also want to make the data available by day so we can kind of look at it we can do kind of a day-to-day analysis on the data. So there essentially what we have is a way of cleaning the data and then merging it into one data frame. And again, for anyone worried about coding, this is already all available on GitHub, and we'll shoot you guys those links at the end of the slide where you can kind of navigate to all of this. So please don't be worried about the code portion of this. So once we've merged the data, we can start doing a bit of exploration. So in the top line, we see that of that search, it revealed 12,485 posts with those particular keywords, suggesting that there were actually 12,485 misleading posts with this notion that at 26 to 27 degrees Celsius, coronavirus dies, which we know isn't true. We also want to look at shares. This goes back to the tipping point. We're not interested in total interactions necessarily, which involves likes and comments and emoji reactions, but we want to see how much traction this content's gotten. So we sum the shares, and what we get is kind of a big number. 681,762 times this particular message has been shared. That's a lot, right? And we also want to look at, anyone that's looking to do kind of a more in-depth analysis might want to study where this type of content most proliferates or proliferates essentially. And here we see that of all those posts, 10,000 of them took place within groups, whereas only 2,000, almost 2,500 took place on pages. So groups is still one of the prominent channels where this misinformation is spreading. And we can also do a bit of statistical analysis, which reveals at first glance something very interesting, that the mean amount of shares per post is almost 55. So each post is shared 55 times, which is a significant amount based on kind of what else we've been seeing. Oftentimes the number isn't this high. So this content and this messaging definitely has some traction. And then what's important, especially as we talk more and more about the tipping point, is we want to look at trends over time. So here we see that the number of shares resulting from these posts spiked in mid-March, right? And if we saw this and we were reporting on this in mid-March, this is kind of a good sign that we might want to do an explainer or publish a debunk about this content, right? But as you can see, if we catch this now, it's not being shared as much. It seems like this content has died. So while it's probably important for us to monitor, it might not be worth us to publish a story on, because we might just be amplifying the content, whereas it has kind of died out in a sense. And another thing we can do is we can look at the top posts from pages and groups. And doing this kind of, it reveals some of the more important message, but it also reveals different pages pushing out this content. And what we can see from this, what I thought was interesting, is the number of pages in different languages, right? So when you look at this, we have a Russian page, we've got a French page, we've got a page arguably from Thailand, we have another Russian page, and we have a Spanish page pushing out the same messaging. So what we can see from this is that this content isn't restricted to one particular context, but this messaging is pretty global. And we can also look at groups and pages posting most frequently, and this will help us to see whether there is possible kind of inauthentic activity going on, or if pages might be coordinating to push out this content, or just to identify pages that are particularly problematic, which you can then add to lists to monitor later. So we have this official sounding page, Coronavirus COVID-19 Informations and Sensibilization, DZ. Which I think is kind of a funny name, especially one that's posting this, 12 times. We also have coronavirus updates, which we've seen on numerous occasions. That's also has been seen to publish suspicious and misleading content. So this just gives you a nice little list of problematic pages that you can then just add to pre-existing lists that you're monitoring, or you can create a new list based off of this as well. And we might want to look at the most popular links in the data set. Oftentimes this reveals organic URLs, not Facebook URLs like you see here. But nonetheless, if we click on any of these, what it does reveal is kind of photos associated with this content. So if you're doing kind of an analysis of not only messaging, but what the medium is, so it's a visual medium, which it has been with this message, you can see that a lot of the misleading messages come accompanied with photos of nurses and doctors. And if you click on every single one of these, it will reveal posts, and then you have a generic photo of doctors and nurses. So the content actually appears relatively official, although it's not. And what's interesting about this post, as you guys might have seen, it's one of the more popular ones that we've seen, is it generally comes prefaced with "my friend from the CDC" or "the UNICEF" or "the WHO said this, this, this," and then with a photo next to it of nurses and doctors. Most people aren't scrutinizing the content that much, and that is kind of convincing enough for them to believe the messaging, right? So that was a very quick run through of some of the things we can do using just some basic computational techniques with CrowdTangle data. And again, what we can do with the Facebook data, which we just looked at, we can also do for Instagram and Reddit. But we can also look at other things like accounts linking to specific URLs. So we can see which ones are sharing problematic URLs, such as YouTube videos that also host misleading content. or that link to specific web articles that are misleading have been debunked. And we can start building out kind of a network of suspicious accounts that are also posting suspicious activity. And this is something we hope to touch on in a kind of a future module with you guys. And we also start looking at the timestamps of posts to look for possible coordination between Facebook pages or groups. And that's something we can also use. We can use the CrowdTangle API to do that. But there are many, many different things we can do with this. And again, although the data is limited, it does give us a lot of scope to investigate trends and do a lot of meaningful reporting. Before we jump into the Twitter API section of this, I know I've covered a lot of ground relatively quickly, so I want to open up this for any questions that people might have.
Well, can I jump in first with a question around, so obviously
Absolutely.
this is, thank you, amazing. It's international. Is this because CrowdTangle is owned by Facebook? Is this all Facebook pages and all Facebook groups, or is people are inputting pages? And what's the scale of their data set that we're drawing from?
So unfortunately, it is limited. It is not everything out there. This is a Facebook product, but because there's so many new Facebook groups and pages that are being opened and created every single day, it doesn't have the capacity to swallow all this and include it within the data that we're looking at. So it actually requires us inputting a lot of these pages and groups into the system as users ourselves. So when you are building lists manually, what you're actually doing is adding sometimes pages and groups that aren't in the system yet. But as soon as they're added, then they're included in the data set and we can start monitoring them as well. And that data that we then download includes all these pages and groups.
Great. And I have another question which somebody raised around, you kind of were talking about the equivalent of Boolean, and you said that commas are ors. And then for ands, it's the next field down. I mean, is it kind of a guide to the ways that Boolean works on CrowdTangle? Or are these really the only ones that you need? Like, can you do the minus sign, for example?
You cannot do the minus sign. No, in terms of in the save search feature, the Booleans they're quite rigid in terms of what you can do with them. There is documentation around it on CrowdTangle's website. What's interesting, and I think they might be in the process of changing all this, is that they've added a new search feature to CrowdTangle, which essentially allows you to add Booleans like you would with Twitter data on TweetDeck. And I think that hopefully is the way that they're going to move forward with all this, and they're going to standardize it across the platform. What we were doing saved searches, you have to use this kind of clunky Boolean search that they've added there. I think the idea behind it was to make it easier for people, but most of us are quite familiar with Booleans at this point, and it's actually more confusing for a lot of us.
Great. And somebody asked the $64 million question, which is, if you work for a big newsroom, yes, you can get access to CrowdTangle, but if you're a freelancer, or let's be honest, working in other countries, it can be harder to get access to CrowdTangle. I mean, I know we've talked to CrowdTangle about this challenge. Do you have any updates, Rory, about trying to get more people access?
Just from talking with people at CrowdTangle, I know they're doing their best to get as many people on as possible. And I know right now, given the situation, they're trying to get access to a lot of people. But I've also had conversations with a lot of journalists in Latin America who are really frustrated because they've been waiting months to get access to it and they haven't. And I encourage them, honestly, to write stories about this, just to apply a bit of pressure where there isn't necessarily any pressure right now, because it's a meaningful story. There shouldn't be these kind of asymmetries, essentially, when it comes to having access to this, because this is really the only way we have to monitor information as journalists. So apply. I think they are getting better in terms of onboarding people as quickly as possible, but at the same time, if nothing is happening, it's probably worth writing a story or just collectively collaborating on a story about this.
And somebody else had the question about, is it possible to get these CSVs in other places other than CrowdTangle? Or, I mean, this is the only place really to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, there are other platforms like BuzzSumo, but again, at that point, you're paying. It's a paid for service. The beauty about CrowdTangle is it's free and it is quite comprehensive. And the people working there are dedicated to make it accessible and easy to use and streamline it specifically for journalists, where BuzzSumo is still very much like a marketing tool. And I know the people at CrowdTangle are really interested in working with researchers and journalists. So yes, there are other options. They're generally paid for. And if you're willing to go for that, there are other things out there, but CrowdTangle is pretty good insofar as what it offers. And it's, most importantly, at the end of the day, it's free.
Yeah, and I think actually as I see you do this, it makes me realize that almost on a daily basis, we should download some of these CSVs and share with journalists so that people can do their own analysis. Because I think there's, as you say, there's such richness in these data sets and we're maybe not seeing all of them. Somebody just asked a great question, which is, if we're tracking their posts, do those people know that we're tracking them? I think, again, this is a huge question about social media, is often people post not understanding how journalists and researchers can look at it, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, the ethics.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question when it comes to the data behind this and journalists and what we do as well, which is watching people without them knowing it. So it comes back to the issue of consent, which is a much bigger discussion, and anonymizing data as well is a huge discussion. We're not going to get into that right now. But the simple answer to your question is no. People do not know that we are getting data on them, essentially. So they are not apprised of the fact that this is happening.
But these are all, just to be clear, these are all public pages and they're public groups. These are not groups that are marked as basically the ones that you have to apply for. These are only public groups and public pages.
Exactly, and that's a really important point. So the interactions we see are only from public-facing pages and groups. And we know a lot of this stuff, unfortunately, is in private channels, and we can't necessarily measure that. So when I say it's a limited take on the total amount of information out there, that's because we only have access to these public Facebook groups and pages. That's it. It's a really good question.
And a couple of other quick questions. Somebody's saying, free access, does it extend to PhD students? My understanding is yes.
Yeah, I've been working with researchers recently and getting them access to it. So it's literally just pinging them. They have an entire different setup for researchers with different data specifications in terms of what you have access to. But yes, anyone doing research has, in theory, access to CrowdTangle, and they have been pretty good about onboarding researchers.
And the last question, I'm sorry if this wasn't clear. Somebody asked, what was the 26/27? And that was actually a viral post that was going around with that specific text, which was people saying that temperature killed the coronavirus. So we should probably find that original post so people can see, because this works clearly when you have a very kind of almost unique term or something that when you're tracking this, you put that in because that's exactly what it said in the original viral post. That's right, isn't it?
That is right. Although you could have just taken 26 and 27 separately and it would have probably surfaced the same thing. What's interesting is I put the backslash in and it also surfaced similar posts, but we're separated by 26 and 27. So I think within the search function, it is quite flexible. But yeah, this one was specifically it was an easy search because that was specifically wording to a lot of these posts. Yeah, and that's exactly what Claire said. This is why we chose this one, because it was looking at content that said the virus died at 26 to 27 degrees Celsius.
I think that's all the questions for right now, but I'm sure there will be more.
Awesome. Cool. Let's get cracking and we will move on to Twitter's API. So like I said before, unfortunately, unless you have access to Twitter's Firehose, you don't really have access to historical data. There are different ways of scraping that historical data, and we will be doing courses about how to do that going forward. It involves kind of OSINT tools that are out there. But for the time being, we're going to focus on Twitter's API and specifically its search API, which will get you data all the way back, as far back as a week. So first off, we just want to explain, when you look at a tweet, what kind of data is out there? And I think this is a very helpful graph, or not a graph, just kind of an illustration of what it is. So everything on a tweet we can get from the API. So that's the account name displayed in the Twitter handle. That's the picture if we want. It's the text, the hashtags, the mentions, the links. It's the content type. We can get the timestamp, and we can get all the different engagement, retweets, likes, and comment fields. And we can also see when the actual account was created too, which we'll get to in a little bit. And I know it's always difficult to gauge, computational experience when you're doing one of these things. So I've also written a piece on how to investigate health misinformation and anything else using Twitter's API, which is a very kind of basic step-by-step guide on how to not only get credentials through Twitter Developer, but how to then kind of build out the script and how you can read Twitter's documentation to then create code that pulls out specific data that might be relevant to you in your newsrooms. So if you're a bit lost right now, don't worry. This piece will break it down in much simpler terms. But first of all, and again, we're going to be using Python and specifically pandas for data analysis. And there is a Python package called TweetPie. So step number one, when kind of tapping into Twitter's API, is to install TweetPie, because it's a package that they created that speaks, the Twitter API language in a very simple way and makes, your coding life much easier. So there are two ways of doing that. One of is doing it through a terminal and just pip installing it. For those of you that are familiar with Python, this is just a installer package that you can use to download TweetPie, or you can clone it on GitHub and do another pip install. And once you have it installed, we can create a file name. We just have the generic file.py here, but you might want to name it like Twitter API.py or py. Whatever your naming conventions might be, doesn't really matter. And in order to get access to Twitter's API and Twitter data, you need to be approved by Twitter, and you need to do that through setting up a Twitter developer account. Generally, this only takes a few days. They have kind of clamped down just because of the amount of inauthentic activity they've seen on the platform over the last years. So that means you'll have to go through kind of an elaborate series of questions that are, that are essentially vetting you to make sure you're not a foreign agent, or you're going to use it to create some massive bot army. And generally, once you fill out those questions, they will approve you and give you your tokens in a matter of days. So once you have your tokens, it's script building time. For those of you that aren't familiar with code or don't know a program, don't worry. This is again on, it's open on our GitHub account. So this is all there. All you need to do is copy and paste and put in your own text editor, and you can run this yourself. No problem. But looking at this, number one is where you're going to put your access tokens and keys, which you will get through Twitter Developer. And again, in the piece that we have on First Draft's website, the piece I highlighted in a previous slide, it will break that down into very simple steps in order to how you get that. Step two in the script is inputting what you're looking for. So most recently, I was looking into the kind of debate around whether or not coronavirus is airborne, and I was looking to analyze what the conversation was on Twitter about this, because it's a very confused debate right now. So my query term was airborne. You can also input hashtags here. So if you just want to collect a list of hashtags related to a hashtag, that's one way of doing it. Or you can put in particular phrases too. That's another way of doing this. And then we want to put in our date, which you can do in the since with the since query there. So you might just be interested in looking at data from one day. And in that case, you'll do since and you'll do that particular day. Generally, we're looking to get as much data as possible, which is, again, restricted to a week back in time. So we'll put that since date a week back from today's date. And then you have the items feature, which is essentially how many tweets you want to rip or scrape from Twitter's API. We've set this to 100,000. You can set it to 5 billion if you want. It doesn't matter. Don't be alarmed if the number of tweets is lower than the items you've inputted. That just means that there haven't been that many tweets related to that particular keyword. That's all that means. So, I mean, you can always err on the side of just not worrying about them putting in a gigantic number. And the worst case scenario is you just get less than that. For this instance, I put 100,000 and I didn't know the conversation was big, but there were more than 100,000 tweets. So I had to run this numerous times. I just had to add, I had to put in a bigger number to get all the tweets around airborne. And then in circle 5, what we have are all the different data fields we're interested in getting from Twitter's API, right? And there is documentation on all of these. This is a tiny little subset of all the different fields that you can get access to. But these are the ones that are generally most important for the type of work we're doing. So you'll see what those are in a second. But that little snippet of code right there is essentially communicating with Twitter's API, pulling those data fields and then throwing them into a data frame, which will then be exported in step 6 as a CSV file. And there, essentially what you want to do is you want to add the path to the folder you want to save it in, as well as the name of your CSV. And once you run this, it will essentially scrape all tweets with that particular word, airborne. And here's a look at the CSV that's outputted from this. And you can see that we have the tweet ID, we have the date it was tweeted at, we got the retweet counts, we got the tweet text, the screen name, the name of the account, when the account was created, the followers and friends, where location is available. It's also inputted, which can be helpful if people are trying to like kind of geofence trends in particular areas. And there are also user descriptions, and there's information on everyone that was retweeting as well. So tons of data fields. And again, this is only a small sample of all the data you can get through Twitter's API. So great, again, similar to what we did with CrowdTangle, it's now analysis time. And so what we're gonna do here is we're gonna open up our CSV in pandas. And oftentimes, well, not often, but sometimes what the data that Twitter's API spits back can be misformatted, or there's extra data that it adds on. I'm not sure why yet. So the first step is always initially kind of like parsing those like malformatted tweets out. And then once you do that, we check how many tweets again there are, and it's 100,000, which is the number we inputted. So we're good to go. Now it is time to analyze what we have downloaded from Twitter's API. And as data journalists, or everyone that's in journalists, we have specific questions we want to ask the data, and that generally determines what data we want to scrape from Twitter's API. So in this instance, we're interested in what are the most frequent messages in the data set, because we kind of want to understand the conversation about whether or not coronavirus, or what people are thinking about coronavirus in terms of whether it's airborne or not. And looking at this reveals that the WHO is the most retweeted text in this data frame, which is optimistic and hopeful in terms of, like, you know, there is official good data that is kind of dominating the discussion on Twitter. But if you go down, you see that there is a lot of conflicting claims around that as well. So there are many instances of which people say coronavirus could be airborne. They cite that Fox News study, and there are actually a few instances in which a doctor uses a video of a WHO official taken out of context to make the argument that coronavirus is actually airborne. So you can see kind of how convoluted and confused the discussion is on Twitter. Just this like easy little snippet of code will reveal that. We also want to look at when the accounts were created. So anyone that's been tracking kind of suspicious or inauthentic activity on Twitter knows that this is one of the kind of best signals or hallmarks of inauthenticity. If you have large groupings of accounts that were created in the last few months or the last few days, it's a pretty good sign that there is a inauthentic campaign, or at least inauthentic activity occurring. So when we look at this, we see that while there are almost 2,000 accounts that were created in March, and specifically in the last few days, most of the accounts here are kind of spread out over time and don't reveal anything too suspicious. And 2,000 accounts created in the last, you know, the last month isn't, while it's worth investigating what these accounts are, this doesn't necessarily, you know, suggest that there's a massive campaign in force. And we also want to look at, like, what are the top hashtags in the data set? So here we use, at the top part of this, we use a bunch of, or a little bit of kind of regex to pull out the hashtags. That's what that top line of code is. And then we create a function for essentially sorting and ranking the amount of tweets, or the amount of like top hashtags within this data set from the tweet text. And then the last part of that code is to visualize it in a bar chart. And so we run that code, it reveals this. So the top two hashtags in the data set, unsurprisingly, are COVID-19 and coronavirus. But you look farther down, there's the hashtag not good news, which until yesterday or a few days ago, I wasn't necessarily familiar with. So now having that information, it'd be interesting to run another scrape of Twitter's API to see what kind of information is associated with not good news. And you go down a bit further, there's airborne, there's WHO, there's COVID, there's CDC, Fox News. There's also WW2 that appears at least a few times. So for you know, I think most of us are familiar, that's linked to a Trump supporters. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of content they might be pushing out there. But nonetheless, to do this kind of hashtag ranking oftentimes reveals a lot of kind of interesting details that are hidden from plain view when you just look at Twitter's interface. So again, these are just a few tiny little examples you can do with Twitter's API. What's also really helpful, and other things we can do with the same data, is we can, instead of parsing out hashtags, we can actually parse out URLs being shared in the data set. So we can see what kind of URLs are being shared around airborne. So what kind of media are people linking to or sharing, what kind of videos, and then we can rank that and see whether it's good information or bad information, so that we can deem kind of how polluted this conversation around whether coronavirus is airborne or not actually is. And we can also get hashtags and keywords like we did for the actual tweet text, but from the bios of users. And we did that in the UK before, to see that a lot of Boris Johnson supporters were actually linked to the Trump campaign as well. So there are ways of actually measuring these kind of, seeing kind of this nuanced stuff that's a bit hidden from plain view again, and then kind of aggregate it in a way that then reveals some meaningful trends. And then we can see what accounts are tweeting the most and who they're mentioning. And with that data, we can kind of start to build out a network of sorts, which we can analyze to see different groupings of communities within tweet data sets. I imagine you guys have seen many kind of network visualizations, but looking at Twitter's API data this way allows us to do kind of similar analyses as well. So again, I know this was a quick run through of different computational techniques, and I know some people are probably very familiar with this, whereas others aren't. Nonetheless, all this code is publicly available through the following links. I've created kind of 2 GitHub repos where you guys can access all this. And again, please don't hesitate ever to reach out with me or to me for any questions related to this. But before going forward, let's see if there are any more questions. Or Claire, do you have anything in particular that you'd like to add in here?
No, this was great, Rory. And I'm just going to say, I watch you do this all the time, but I've never actually seen you present it in this way. And as somebody who is not a data journalist, and I have not done this before, I have just been left wanting to learn more. So I actually put something in the chat myself, which is, does anybody want a kind of this for dummies? And quite a few people said that they would like a really basic, like, what's GitHub? So I actually, because I know that you struggle to know how to pitch this. And so I think this has been amazing, almost as a kind of a teaser of what you can do if you learn these skills. So I think what we're going to, if people have asked for some kind of basic explainers for some of these things, so that like a few of us, we've got extra time on our hands these days, can go and do some playing. But this has been a really excellent introduction. So I don't know if anybody else has any last questions about this section. Somebody said, yes, intro for dummies. But I think, to be honest, I think the only way people are inspired to go and learn new skills is when they see how they can apply it. And for me right now, trying to get a handle on all of this coronavirus misinformation, it's very easy to find things manually and to believe that there's a trend. But actually, if we don't do this kind of analysis, it's very easy to like jump to conclusions without saying, well, no, actually the amount of people sharing this is very small. And I think the point about the tipping point is so critical, which is just because we find it doesn't mean that we should be reporting on it right now.
I just want to second that, what Claire just said. It's like one of the things that makes me feel most uncomfortable about the work that we do as journalists around mis and disinformation is we might see something really interesting that's very misleading, that's very conspiratorial, but it might have only been seen by 2 people. And oftentimes that content is published all too quickly and overzealously, and then amplifies that message, whereas again, it would have died on itself. So having access to those metrics and really knowing how far it's spread is really, really, really important and vital to anyone reporting on this stuff.
And I think I would say, like, my background is, like, my training is in qualitative research. So when you have those huge data sets around temperature, I'm like, I want to see all 10,000 Facebook posts because maybe they're not all about temperature. So there's that balance of how do we make sure that we're using this data, but not kind of trip into kind of a landmine situation where we don't know the wider context. And I think that's the joy of having people like you on a team and people who are automatically going to be driven to qualitative analysis. And the sweet spot is the combination of the two.
Absolutely.
Oh, so somebody said, do you have specific metrics or is it a matter of judgment for each case? This is a great question about the tipping point. And unfortunately, it's if you do this work a lot, you start to get a sense of what the metrics are for your particular news outlet. So if you write for the New York Times or you write for Folio in Sao Paulo, you kind of get a sense of, well, in our community, this is what something has kind of pushed through the tipping point. But it's hard to say, oh, it's 79,000 retweets, but it becomes a comparison, which is, okay, last week we saw a lot of problematic content and it was hitting these levels. This rumor is down here and that's not the same. So I think I wish I could give something that was a little bit more concrete, but it's a reason why journalists shouldn't parachute into social media and say, I've got all the answers. Because as we know, social media is a community and it's about understanding that community, not just using the numbers in isolation. Great. Any final questions before we wrap up? I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, Rory, and Nell is going to send out the notes at the end.
We do have one more question that says, do you also receive information regarding the location of where the tweet was sent or the country?
Yes. So honestly, unfortunately, it depends on whether people publish that within kind of the user info that's available on their own tweets. A lot of people do, most people don't. So where it's available, we can use it. But again, it's not comprehensive because most people don't want to reveal that type of information. But depending on the data set, people oftentimes do, and that might be good enough, at least as a general sample to gauge what kind of information is being shared within a community or a state or a country. So yeah, to be like, yeah, the data is available, but not always.
Great. It used to be on Twitter that it kind of pulled from the GPS from people's phone, but that no longer is something that we can do, which is good for privacy, difficult for verification. Great. So I think I'm just going to end by letting everybody know that we have a portal on our site, which is a set of resources for journalists working on coronavirus. And so you can see in that content, we have many different elements to that, including a number of different webinars. We've asked Rory, he did this in Spanish 2 hours ago, so he's our hero today. We're trying to do many of these webinars in different languages, and we've asked Rory to potentially run one of these once or every 2 weeks so we can kind of scale up how advanced these trainings are. But we're also running a lot of other ones around the ethics of doing this work, how to monitor and choose keywords, how to choose images, the ethics of monitoring closed messaging groups. So there's lots there, and they're all linked out to on our webinar page. And also yesterday, we launched a new 2-hour online course designed for journalists covering coronavirus. And so it's on a learning portal. The link is available from our website. And so we would encourage as many people as possible to share this as widely as you can. It's all brand new material that we created specifically for journalists. It's about how to monitor, how to verify, and how to responsibly report. But this material is not in it. So this is extra stuff that's going to sit on our YouTube channel. So for the questions of, I came late, or can I watch again? It's going to be on our YouTube channel very soon. And Nell has also, will be sending out an email with all of this information. So the final thing I want to say is, thank you very much for joining this webinar on reporting coronavirus. My name is Claire Wardle. I'm the US Director of First Draft, and huge thanks to Rory Smith, who is our research manager, and for Nell for herding the cats. And if you want to keep in contact, please follow us on Twitter or visit our site, firstdraftnews.org. And everybody stay safe. Thank you very much.